shot very well. I will give it that. The cinematography is amazing, but.
Right, we are going live.
Yeah, I mean, this woman sounds not very nice.
All right.
Hi, people.
Hey, people. I'll focus it on you in a second. So welcome, everyone, to this event with Augustus Durham and Brittnay Proctor for Stay Black and Die on Melancholy and Genius. Give it up. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder of this space, the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. We are an independent, all-volunteer queer bookstore. We've been around since 2012, and we've been here at the center since 2014. The short explanation for our very lengthy name is that we are a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. Our regular business hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open late when we have events. If you're not already on our email list and you'd like to be, you can sign up for that at the back of the room, or those of you watching online on our website, BGSQD. So before we get started, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement and a call for a ceasefire in Gaza. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Houses Mannahatta Fund. American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. I've read this how many times? The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. We also want to recognize that today, April 20th, is the 197th day of Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people, funded by our tax dollars and enabled by our government's unwavering support. We hope that you will join us in calling for an immediate, permanent ceasefire, an end to the siege, and an end to the occupation in order to stop the collective punishment of Palestinians and to ensure the swift delivery of desperately needed food, water, medicine, fuel, and humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. And I'm now realizing, where did I put your bios? Oh, that was smart. I can read yours from the back of this book, right? Oh, no, it's short.
We could just introduce ourselves, yeah.
There you go. Yeah. Thank you. I printed it out. It's somewhere.
It's okay. It's okay.
Please give it up for Augustus
Yeah.
and Brittnay Proctor.
Oh, so. Hi. Oh, okay. Not me being like.
You're on.
We're on.
You're seeing
Okay.
people we know, yeah.
Hello, my name is Brittnay Proctor. I'm an assistant professor of race and media at the School of Media Studies at the new school. Sorry, it's Saturday, giving Saturday break. What do I do? That's fine. You can just, that's good enough. I think.
And I'm Augustus Durham. I'm assistant professor of English at Lehman College and the City University of New York. And I wrote a book.
Yeah. All right, I have about 7 questions.
Okay.
But I'm also open to not asking all 7 so that there's ample time for folk to ask questions. So I want to start by saying congratulations on the publication of this work. It's freaking phenomenal. If folk don't have copies, there's copies for purchase, so please be sure to buy a copy today. I will be, Professor Durham will be more than happy to sign it for you. Not me like offering you up that way, but so I will get straight into it. Your work is an examination of the vestibularity of the Black feminine maternal, as you frame it. The vestibularity of the Black feminine maternal to culture writ large, but in particular, the Black cultural work of race men, plus Butler's gone. I wanted to know why it was important for you to theorize the central role of the feminine in cultivating Black masculine genius.
Well, first, let me say thank you, Brittnay, for being here with me. Also, I want to plug her book, a reading of Many Rippertons Come to My Garden on Bloomsbury's 33 and the Third series. It's excellent. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this with Brittnay is because she has a chapter on gardens, which aligned with one of my chapters on Octavia Butler. So I thought, oh, she'd be perfect. So for that, I want to say thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Oh, God. Thank you for having me.
The Black feminine maternal Black masculine. Okay, yes. So I really kind of arrived to it through my own biography. I opened the book talking about how when I was a child, when I would say to my mother, I want X, my mother would say, all you need to do is stay Black and die. So from a really early age, my mother was saying that to me. And so I think that what the book kind of embodies is the fact of her saying that to me and how that has resonated over time. I'm just really that it actually allowed me to produce something, right? I mean, so much of the work is really kind of trying to unpack what it means to think about genius, and in particular, Black masculine genius, in part because oftentimes the way we understand genius is by way of thinking that the person who's engaging in genius is self-made, that the person arrives at this moment of, you know, high intellectual possibility or creative possibility on his own. And so much of the book is trying to kind of unpack that actually oftentimes there's a cadre of people who are actually supporting that genius, supporting that creativity, supporting that intellect. And what it means that culturally, we're oftentimes enamored with the product, but not actually the origin. And so, you know, I'm looking at Frederick Douglass, Ralph Ellison, Marvin Gaye, Octavia Butler's short story, Blood Child, with a character named Gan, and then Kendrick Lamar. And the thing I also will say, I've tweeted about this, but I'll share it here in the event you all are not on Twitter/X, is that another way in which the project emerges as a kind of anecdotal example is the weekend of my graduation from Duke University with my PhD. It was the weekend of Beyonce's Coachella, Beachella. And also let me preface this by saying this is not me capping for her or anything like that. It's just an example of anecdotally, you can like her now. It's fine. So the weekend of my graduation, my hooding, Beachella happens. I'm at a party with some other Black PhDs who are about to graduate. And there's a man there who's an NMD who's married to a PhD. His wife is a historian. And at one point he says, you know, Beyonce's not a genius. And we said, oh, how do you arrive at that? And he said, well, because in order for her to pull off Coachella, she has to have a team. And then he says, but Kendrick Lamar is genius. And we said, oh, well, why? And he said, because he can do all of that stuff on his own. And to me, that's a really good anecdotal example of what I'm getting at in the work, is that, again, Kendrick Lamar is read as being self-made. Like everything he does, he can do on his own, even though we obviously know that there's a team involved. And that somehow Beyonce is, you know, only ever able to accomplish things on her own, with a team, even though we know that obviously there's a lot more going on than just that. But again, I would say that culturally, there's a lot, that's a way in which we oftentimes are reading genius in particular. Is that, you know, like this man gets up and does this thing and we're enamored by the fact that he can do it on his own. And the book is trying to say actually the Black feminine maternal in that man's life actually undergirds, supports, oftentimes actually imparting the intellect to that man in order to perform the acts of genius, so that genius really is more of a collective idea as opposed to an individual one. And certainly for me with Melancholy, it also is a way to think about how oftentimes the genius emerges through the loss of what might be the Black feminine or the maternal. So that in those ways, the Black feminine maternal is so important to the project.
Thank you very much. In the preface of the book titled Echo, you delineate your reading practice and the discursive practices that you employ. And given the pervasive use of Black art by critics and academics alike to make certain claims around freedom or humanity, why did you approach writing the preface in the particular way that You do.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Actually, the preface didn't exist originally. Originally the preface was in the introduction, but the introduction was quite long. One of my readers said, you should cut it. This is publishing speak, basically. So you have readers, they
Reader
kind of,
two.
yeah, exactly, there's a reader one and reader two. This was reader one, luckily for me. But basically you have readers who kind of, legitimate whether or not the project is worthy of publication. So my reader one said, I think the introduction is a bit too long, so you should probably make a preface. And in the preface, you should kind of set out the terms of what you're going to do so that once you get to the introduction, you can kind of jump right into the reading. So, yeah, so the preface was originally in the introduction. But again, the opening of the preface is kind of that anecdote about my mom. And then one of the reasons why I wrote the preface like I have is because I'm also kind of knowing how people read books. I basically am trying to tell you what I'm about to do so that if you don't read the rest of it, you can at least whet your appetite with the preface and presumably the introduction. I mean, of course, I would like you to read the whole thing. But there's that. But I mean, the other thing too is that in a lot of ways, the project kind of showcases all of where I've been. And what I mean by that is that in undergrad, I majored in architecture. I went to seminary, and then I have this degree in English. And so in the preface, one of the kind of methodological moves that I make is to say that I'm kind of doing something that we learned in seminary called exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is the drawing out, and then the eisegesis is reading in. So in those ways, I'm kind of doing what I would say is more typical close reading. But then the eisegesis, I would say, allows me to do some speculation based on what the people I'm writing about tell, share, kind of, into it. And so, yeah, I kind of tried to do in miniature in the preface what the whole book is trying to do. And I would say in some ways the introduction is doing a similar thing. So that again, like by reading the preface, it hopefully opens up the possibility for what you will encounter in the rest of the project. I think the last thing I'll say about the preface as well is that in the preface, I also am kind of trying to lay a certain kind of historical perspective, in part because melancholy and genius as an idea, or as a twinned idea, is actually quite old. So I mean, as far back as Aristotle. So in some ways too, I'm also kind of trying to track the kind of long arc of what melancholy and genius as a kind of twinned ideas has as kind of long historical arc, although I'm not a historian. So I kind of try to wade into that a bit. But yeah, I think the preface is really an opportunity to kind of in miniature show what the book is up to.
Thank you. That's a very beautiful response. Okay, so I'm gonna read from the text and then I have
Okay.
a question. Don't
I hope I remember what I wrote.
worry, I'm gonna read it too.
Okay.
Maybe it'll jog your memory.
Okay.
You write on page 29, if the quote unquote intramural is worthwhile terrain, is the phobogenic objecthood of the Black feminine maternal enumerated not only in her quote unquote first impression with quote unquote them, but also when her quote unquote son told to quote unquote sing go, leaves quote unquote home to be quote unquote groomed. A quote unquote man of the people, yet returns having gained wisdom and deems her nothing in both quote unquote tongue and temperament. I'm really struck by your formulation of the intramural in this work, and the intramural is crucial in your thinking in this book. And I was curious as to how you hold on to this space of generativity for Black people being the intramural, while also thinking about the almost unilateral antagonism between Black maleness and the Black feminine maternal.
That's great. So what I want to say is that the book is filled with a lot of tension, kind of on purpose. In part because of the intramural. The intramural is an idea that kind of really gets generated by the theorist Hortense J. Spillers. And it's kind of the kind of machinations, the ongoing kind of relationship that occurs within the Black community. And I even say, actually even say community, because that's such a kind of fraught, kind of thing.
Mhm.
And so I think some of why the intramural is interesting to me is because given that the focus of the book is Black thinkers and Black creativity, in a lot of ways, I am wanting to put some pressure on how we understand community. But I think also put some pressure on how easily we want to forego the antagonisms that community sometimes offers. And so, throughout the text, I'm really wrestling with, these men and their real ambivalence about the women in their lives, their real ambivalence about being coded as feminine, their real ambivalence about acknowledging the women in their lives. And for that matter, too, the intramural also becomes complicated, and actually, one of the reasons why we're here, because there's also throughout the book moments of queerness, moments of transness, moments of the body in flux around gender and sexuality that I think also kind of plays up some of that kind of intramural anxiety. And so in that moment from the introduction, I'm really kind of trying to play around with what happens around the particular intramural of the home and the mother and the son. And how the mother kind of imparts certain kind of knowledge to the son. And in some ways, this is really me playing around with Frantz Fanon. And the notion of like, and Black Skin, White Master, like you're in this colonized space, and then you go to the metropole, and then you come back, and everyone is enamored with, your travels. You also kind of have an understanding of yourself as being different from the people that you have come from. And so, in those ways, the intramural to me remains a site of a kind of ambivalence. And I think some of that ambivalence also has emerged by the ways people have received the book. Like when I had given papers for the book, like in particular, when I've given a paper on Marvin Gaye, I mean, people are very anxious about the way I talk about Marvin Gaye, even though the knowledge is readily accessible. And so I think the intramural is still kind of playing up a certain kind of concern that I think persists around, what does it mean to be in community, and what does it mean to be a part of a community that antagonizes you still? And I mean, I also even think about maybe last year, Spillers was at a talk at Brown University, and someone asked her also a question about the intramural, and she said, insofar as I write about the intramural, some of the biggest pushback that I've received in my career has been from other Black people, and so I think that also kind of helps to set up the kind of anxiety that I think exists around intramural. And I think the last thing I'll say is that, and why I opened by saying the book has a lot of tension in it, is I think because in the academy, in the academy, I think there are strains of the academy that want to suggest the intramural is a nice space. And I want to say that it's not always nice. And so also the tension of the book that's happening on the page sometimes is me both rehearsing what I've learned and also leaning into trying to unlearn it. And so much of that is around the intramural and around, especially being in the academy, the kind of ambivalence that I even still feel around my work, the reception of my work, how people talk about work of my friends. The ways in which, the intramural is still a fraught category, even in the academy. So yeah, in the book, that tension that exists is both kind of like the understanding of my life as a scholar, but also my life that exceeds the scholarship, and just the way in which we kind of understand community, and how I kind of want to put some pressure into that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that framing, especially because in the preface, you're pretty insistent, at least in my reading of you, you're insistent that this is a Black studies project, but also what does it mean to hold that tension and throughout the work, and think about all of these fraught moments of encounter between subjects, turned object, or yeah, keeping your ambivalence around subjecthood, right? I think that's really, really important, because there's this weird thing around Black studies and the affirmative or the, right, like that being the presumptive logic. And I think that you using the intramural, the way you use the intramural in this work is forcing us to contend with that formulation of Black studies. So.
Yeah. And I think, to piggyback off what you said, I mean, I think, that's what I mean about the reception, right? Is that I have been in situations where people receive it as me being completely negative. I'm like, well, what's that about? Like, and a kind of pushback, like, why isn't it more affirmative or joyous? And I think that the book is holding all of that intention, which is, I think, is why the melancholy and genius is like always getting pushed. Because certainly there's a way in which we would code genius as a kind of positivity, the melancholy, this loss as a kind of negativity. But I'm kind of trying to say that, like, when you hold both intention, you may actually get somewhere, especially even around things like the intramural. So, I mean, yeah, I think that you're exactly right, that there's a way in which we kind of don't want to kind of delve into the negative. That's why I was bringing up Marvin Gaye, like, we don't want, don't talk about that. That's not really what we want, to kind of maintain a kind of pristine image. And so I'm like, well, for me, why not just tell something like the truth or the truth, right? But I think too, and maybe this also is what I mean around the academy. I remember when I was writing the book, I was in a position where I didn't know if I was going to get a job. And so in a lot of ways, what I think the way the book also emerges is I kind of in a position where I'm like, I'm just going to say what I want to say. And it'll be what it'll be. So, I think some of the boldness, or what I've heard people say, like, it's kind of bold. The kind of boldness I think that's in the book is best because I kind of was writing for my life. Yeah. Like I kind of, it was like, well, if you don't have a job, at least you're going to tell people what you think about these things.
I mean, it's also like, why write a book for tenure if I don't even have a permanent position? And what are the implications of that? Like writing a book for tenure versus writing a book that, anyway,
so
same.
You get it. Yeah.
I was right there. This job.
You understand.
Woo, fighting for my life. So can you say more about the dyads that title each vignette or chapter of the book? And this is my suspicion, right? Bear with me. I suspect that the tunis you use is related to the dyad of mourning and melancholia, but also related to how you're thinking about dimorphic sex and gender, for example, the categories of male and female.
Yeah, that's a spot on reading. So I'll give a pragmatic response and then a kind of theoretical response. Pragmatically, I wanted the chapter titles to be very sparse because I knew the chapters would be dense. So the chapters are very like, there's a lot going on. They're in, I opened the book saying that it's a symphony. So I very deliberately write the chapters as if they're movements. So I was like, well, I'll give like a very short chapter title to kind of counteract the density of the chapter. So pragmatically, that's why they're short. But yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, the way the titles are working is it is that dyad, but also and I didn't realize this until after I submitted the manuscript. So the second half of the title is usually the person's name that I'm going to talk about. In the first half of the title, originally I was thinking, it could be nouns. Like, so it's read, travel, man, woman, love. But then I was like, but it could also be verbs, right? So there's a way that it is kind of playing around with language. So this is me kind of, in the introduction, I talk about playing the dozens. So this is me kind of playing the dozens where it's like both the verb and the noun, which is, again, it's like a very big thing in like, kind of like, especially Black arts, people like, verbs and nouns, right? I think Amiri Baraka maybe has an essay called verb and noun. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think so. So verbs and nouns, but yeah, I'm also kind of trying to, in a very terse way for the reader, kind of, again, like clue you into like what you're about to experience. So in the case of, say, Frederick Douglass, Read Frederick is really about his reading practice and how I'm kind of trying to unpack that. Travel Ralph, about Ralph Ellison, is about him traveling and what it means to be above ground and below ground and all these places that he goes. Man, Marvin is a play on Trouble Man,
Mhm.
right? But also the ways he's wrestling with masculinity and gender. Woman Gan is the chapter that I would say leans heavily into like a lot of gender theory. You know, kind of like a play on the gender wars of the 80s and taking up Judith Butler, Alice Walker, these kinds of things. In particular with Gan, it's interesting because the nature of the story is that he is a pregnant boy. So what kind of pressure is Octavia Butler putting around notions of like the pregnant man, what it constitutes a woman, that kind of thing, and the ways in which she's even exploding that idea, right? And then Kendrick Lamar and Love. I was playing around with his record I, where he talks about I love myself. And also the fact that for that that chapter, I'm thinking about To Pimp a Butterfly, you know, in some ways I probably could have called it love. Right? Because again, with To Pimp a Butterfly, it's like, you know, I hate myself, but I love myself. And what does it mean to be a pimp? What does it mean to be a butterfly? And like all of these kind of dyads. You know, of course, it's interesting because in the case of Kendrick Lamar, he's also a Gemini.
Yes, diet.
So, you know,
Yeah,
so, you know,
Tunis,
so that Tunis is always there. But yeah, I think that you're right. Like in some ways, the chapters also are playing with that kind of dimorphic thing around melancholy and genius. And in particular, because again, like the genius is the named, the named person, and that the melancholy kind of emerges through that verb down kind of thing. So yeah, pragmatically, again, very short for like a dense chapter, but also yeah, that kind of two-ness. Again, in the introduction, I talk a lot about double consciousness. You know, the in and out, the exegesis, the eisegesis, you know, all that happening. So yeah, I think that read that you're giving is
Thanks. I just wanted it's in the details for me.
Yeah.
I was like, wait, this is doing something, but I'm not sure. Thank you for elaborating on chapter titles. I'm a nerd.
no.
Yeah. Okay. You should have favorites in regards to such a tremendous work, but chapter 3, Man Marvin, is my favorite.
Okay.
It seems that you're inverting the condition of the slave and their descendants and taking seriously patrilineality via Marvin's melancholic genius. And here I'm thinking about his relationship to his father as a source of wounding loss, as well as your reading of Gay vis-a-vis Douglas and his mimetic use of Aunt Hester's scream. I think it's just very, very smart. And that being a kind of fatherly inheritance for Gay. Can you say more about patrilineality and its relationship to the Black feminine maternal? Really, anything else about that chapter? Because I really.
Thank you. So that chapter is an interesting chapter because so again, another reason why I wanted to kind of do this with you. The way you open your book is kind of how that chapter really emerged for me because as a child, my father had a VHS of Motown 25. So basically from being very little, my father would play that and we would watch it. So Marvin Gaye has kind of been in my head since I was quite young enough to understand what music was. In that celebration, he does What's Going On, but it is it's kind of showcased by dancers who basically simulate Ernie Barnes Sugar Shack. So you know, it's kind of like this kind of very big mosaic kind of, right? But I have a very, very vivid recollections of that. So I knew when it was time to write my dissertation, I knew that I was going to write about Marvin Gaye. The interesting thing about this chapter, which is why essentially you say it's your favorite, is because there's a part of me that wants to say I think it's my favorite chapter too. But the other thing about that chapter, which is interesting, is that and I talk about this, I think, in the introduction. There's a way that Marvin Gaye could have taken over my project. So I think a lot about Toni Morrison is talking about, I think she's talking about Pilate and Song of Solomon. And she said, you know, I had to tell Pilate to shut up.
Yep.
And I think that there's a way that Marvin Gaye was going to take over my project because once you get started, you're like, where, you know, and I'm really only focusing primarily on the childhood, but you know, like it can really keep going. And so sometimes it'd be like you have to, right? But yeah, patrilineage. I mean, I think, you know, certainly in his case, there's so much chaos going on in the household. as a child. That there's a way, I think by the end of the chapter, I'm kind of trying to intimate this. I don't say this explicitly, but it's almost as if he never had a chance. Because there's just so much happening in that household. You know, again, the father's a minister, the house is the church, the father is pretty abusive. You know, Marvin says something like, you know, by the time I was 12, there was an inch in my body that was covered in bruises. The father's then cross-dressing. You're like, what, you know, so the father, who's the pastor's cross-dressing in the house, that's the church. The son starts cross-dressing too in the private moments. He's our sexual healing hero. You know, all of these things are happening, right? And so that's what I'm saying. It really could have taken over the project. But yeah, you know, I think the thing about the patrilineal move that's interesting to me is that, as I say in the chapter, you know, like, although we are, you know, what, 3 or 4 generations removed, you know, like the kind of synchronicity of Frederick Douglass to the life of his father seems to suggest to me something about the kind of continuities that we can constantly see around the negative. Right. You know, like, and so I think the thing about the patrilineal also that's interesting to me is that his father really kind of, and this goes back to an earlier response, the fact of his father being in that house and doing all of that really plays into that deep anxiety about the feminine. That deep anxiety about, you know, first pillar is the female within.
Yes.
And the ways that we want to categorically boycott that, and yet at the same time, from Marvin Gaye, he will say, and yet, you know, like something about that feminine, especially by way of Marian Anderson and Mahalia Jackson, I think actually influences his creativity.
Yes.
You know, it influences his ability to sing. You know, it influences all these things about his work ethic. And so I think for me, the patrilineal in that chapter is really kind of the flux. It's constantly in flux. And, you know, certainly him being a father as well, you know, his relationship with Janice Gay and all the chaos of that, right? You know, so as I say in the opening of the chapter, I'm not trying to excuse his behavior, but I think what I'm trying to do is narrate to such a degree that by the time you get to the end, you can kind of see, not only they didn't have a chance, but like, it's almost like the behavior becomes some way oddly legible. And by oddly legible, I mean that we see his behavior is then mimicked in people like he who shall not be named. And others, you know, who shall not be named. And so, yeah, to me, the patrilineal in that chapter is really kind of the flux. And especially also the fact that patrilineal is happening alongside the matrilineal, who is watching it happen all the time, and is saying things like, I knew he didn't love him, but I stay. You know, he was wearing my undergarments, and I stay. You know, and so it's also one of those moments where I'm trying not to make judgments because I can recognize that there may not have been a way out. But yeah, the patrilineal in that chapter, I think is, you know, but I will also say, now that the book is out and I've gone back and reread it, that chapter gives me the most trouble. Because I think that there's some things that I argue where I'm like, if you say that, that might have some consequences. So like, for example, with the book out and me having reread it, I almost wonder if by the end of the chapter, I'm arguing that we should never sing Trouble Man again. Because if I'm right that it's a way in which he's narrating his childhood, then every time we sing it, it's kind of a weird praise of trauma. You know, recently they just found a cassette of his music in Belgium. It'll be interesting to kind of think about that. But yeah, you know, like, again, I think there's a way in which also some of the fluxes that, because I have a very, very vivid recollection of him as a child, there's a way in which like he kind of has a kind of weird patrilineal presence in my life, right? As someone who I think also both stylistically and someone that I'm writing about, like, is someone who has had some influence on me in my thinking. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't, he probably will never leave. Even insofar as I'm thinking about another project where I'm thinking about where I'm pretty sure I'm gonna write about him again. But yeah, I mean, again, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this with you is because the way you narrate listening to Minnie Riperton, I'm like, yeah, that's really, and it stays with you.
Yeah.
And it really shapes you and kind of gives you some things to think about at the level of just like theorizing it and discourse. So yeah. It's like I'm not gonna say he's my father. That's like weird. But I do think that he continues to have a very, very signal influence on my thinking, in ways that I didn't think would happen, but also may be totally obvious.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really enjoyed the way the chapter is, the whole trying to narrate through and hold space of like, what does it mean to yearn for this kind of, yearn for the patriarchals, like, or like this patrilineal repair, like this repair with father, while also wanting to say yes to the female within, and in moments saying yes, but then also wholly rejecting and mythologizing around, like overly compensating by
Yes.
the way he treats women, the
Yes.
way that, right?
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
I love that chapter very, very much. I really appreciate that. Hope you write a whole book on Gray. That'd be great. Not to tell you what to do with your
You'll see.
efforts.
But I mean, for what it's worth too, I mean, as we're talking, like, there are a lot of people who I know I'm in conversation with about gay, who I think have the same kind of like, a colleague of ours, Darius Carter, has a 33 1/3 that I believe is coming out on I Want You, the album I Want You. And certainly, like one of my mentors, Mark Anthony Neal, has written extensively on Marvin Gaye. So yes, like he kind of has a weird hold on a lot of people. And like I said, I don't necessarily know what that means, but I'll just lean into it. See what happens.
Well, I hope we get to hear more from Gay via your brilliant thinking and writing. So relatedly, this book could have easily been a Black Sound Studies text, in my mind. Why think across the mediums that you've chosen? I know that's kind of a basic question, but I'm just interested.
Oh yeah. So some of the choices of chapters was rather strategic, in that I wanted to write about people who are known. And what I mean by that is that some of my goal was to say, the goal is not that I'm trying to be right, or wrong in the book, but really just to say that, like, after you read my chapter on Frederick Douglass, when you approach Douglass again, you won't think about him the same thing, right? So some of that is about just like, the choice. Again, like I knew I was gonna write about Marvin Gaye. So although my training is in English, like I knew I was gonna make that happen. It was just really more kind of grounding it in a text, right? But for what it's worth, I will share that, originally Kendrick Lamar was not in the book. Originally, partly because I didn't want to write a long book. I was like, oh, I'll just write a 4-chapter book, that'll be it. Like, I didn't want to write a preface. I was like, oh, the book's gonna be very long. I was done with the manuscript, was ready to send it in, and my editor said to me, I would like to see the Kendrick Lamar chapter. And I was like, okay. I said, well, you have to give me like a month. So I added it, but I added it thinking that when I sent the manuscript in, he was gonna cut it. Because I was like, it's a 5-chapter book, there's a preface, there's, it's long, and he didn't cut it. That to me was kind of more like maybe some serendipity, because the album dropped when I was in grad school. And I had been thinking about, Kendrick Lamar too kind of has a similar kind of presence in my head, because I've been thinking about To Pimp a Butterfly since it dropped in 2015, which is one of the reasons why it took so long for me to write about it. Because, especially now culturally, people already have think pieces about Taylor Swift's album that dropped yesterday. Beyonce's album dropped that night, right?
Yeah.
So, it happens very, very fast. But yeah, I knew that I wanted to write about people that were well known. Again, I knew Marvin Gaye was going to be there. The other people in the book kind of were in my head for a long time too, but I would even say they kind of emerged randomly. So originally there was not going to be a Ralph Ellison chapter. Originally it was going to be a Richard Wright chapter.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I was going to do it right. And my committee said, "Oh, go read and like come back." And then I started reading. So I think the first thing I read was maybe Richard Wright's Blues, his essay, Ellison's essay, Richard Wright's Blues. And I was like, oh, like there's the underground. And then I think I read Little Man Shall Sing, and I was like, oh, there's like women in the underground, like I'm sure that Ralph Ellison's, there's that. But I mean, there's a part of me that also wants to say, and I think this is also why I opened the book saying it's a symphony, is that so much of the book and the ways I'm reading Melancholy and Genius is actually around hearing. Like it's Frederick Douglass hearing a rumor about his mother. It's Ralph Ellison being around women who are like musicians and hearing all of these kinds of anecdotal things. It's Marvin Gaye and Mahalia Jackson and Marian Anderson. I mean, and certainly it's like these memories that he has of his mother saying these things, right? Kendrick Lamar is a bit different insofar as like I kind of am speculating about it. But I mean, like certainly if we look at Good Kid, Mad City, his mother is there.
Yeah.
And certainly too, at the end of Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, Maya Angelou is there, right? So like there are people that are there. But yeah, I mean, I knew that I kind of knew for sure that I was gonna write who I was gonna write about, just kind of emerged that way. But yeah, I would say like generally, again, a lot of it does have to do with these men and how they hear, and who they're listening to. But the other thing I also say methodologically is that coming from my own background in the arts and particularly singing, that I think one of the reasons why I'm also deeply invested in sound studies is because, and I've said this in print, that I want all my work to sing. So I know that doesn't always manifest the way I want it. So, the reference that I make is that sometimes the work comes and sometimes the work really does sing. And I'm like, I think I wrote something really good there. But yeah, like there's a way that, and maybe this also ties into your question about exegesis and eisegesis, it's as much about me theorizing how these men hear as it is how I hear them. And how I'm reading their mode of hearing and how I'm also like looking for like, there's a sonic register there that to me seems really interesting, or there's something here that like this man doesn't talk about that to me sounds sonic. So yeah, in those registers, yeah, the sound, there's always sound. Which maybe is also interesting why, for the fact that when I write, I usually don't play music. Because I think there's too much going on. There's too much noise. And so I think that's also why I'm saying, like, I try to really listen to how these race men are kind of leading me, even as I kind of detour and veer away from what they're saying. So yes, as much as of me theorizing their listening as it is how I'm trying to listen.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, the part about you listening and how you're listening, because, there's a lot of self-reflexivity in this work, but not in a auto-ethnographic or auto-theory kind of way, but it's like, we know who you locate yourself in a way that I think is important to the kind of reading that you are engaging in throughout the work. And yes, and also because you're thinking about the intersubjective via Spillers, and I just find it to be like very beautifully done.
Thank you.
Okay, I have one more question, and then I could ask a million more, but I'll open it up.
I'm gonna ask you a question.
What? Not you. See? All right, maybe I'll have it. Okay. So can we territorialize or define what Black genius is? I don't think this is what your book is necessarily invested in, but it's making me think about Black genius, especially because it was a term of intellectual interest for me early in my career. My first peer-reviewed article was about sounding Black women's affectability and genius via the work of Patrice Rushen. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Whew, I know, right?
Yeah, Black genius. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Something that I always think is interesting is, and this is another example, maybe this is genius, maybe. Donny Hathaway has a live album, and in the live album, he does a cover of Stevie Wonder's Superwoman. And he prefaces it by saying, from the Black pool of genius. And then he covers it, right? So maybe that's genius, maybe. Or an example of Black genius. Yeah, I don't know. I think the book is trying to get at something, like some possibilities about what it might be. You know, again, in the introduction, there's a moment where I kind of give some etymological backing to what genius is, you know, like, you know, parents and the spirit, you know, so for a while I was like thinking maybe it's the spirit. So that, you know, again, if we take Trouble Man, you know, like the genius of this, that it's Marvin Gaye channeling Marian Anderson, Mahalia Jackson. Like maybe that's the possibility. Or, you know, again, with say someone like Kendrick Lamar, you know, that his falsetto could be a kind of interesting interplay of Prince, who also is engaging in some kind of modes of androgyny. You know, that would suggest something about, you know, the voice, and something around gender and sexuality. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
I think the way that I think that, not that you're even trying to territorialize genius, Black genius, or that that's a term that you're particularly even interested in, but I do think the way that you're trying to be insistent about holding the very capacious and sometimes unsettling, sometimes violent space in the intramural, but like sitting with that and basically sitting in the hold.
Yeah.
That's my approximation of Black genius via your beautiful, beautiful book.
I mean, I'll take suggestions because I really, because I don't know. I mean, so I'll give an example of a moment that I was like, I don't know if I like that. I gave a paper on Marvin Gaye, and during the Q&A, someone said that was genius to the paper, and I was like, I don't like, thank you, yeah, but like I don't think it's that. Because if I'm thinking about the spirit, then in many ways, the genius act would be the fact that I'm channeling through all these people, like at once. So in those ways, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think you may be onto something about like what it means to hold all of it in tension. And kind of sit back with my notepad and be like, oh, like, why are you doing that over there? I'm like, why is over there? But again, like, I think, like I said about Donny Hathaway, like, it's not like he says the pool of Black genius. He says the Black pool of genius. And I think that distinction is important. I just don't know how.
I think it's still, yeah, I think it's just it's getting back to the way that you're rethinking the relational, or like, or that you're getting us away from community. Yeah, I think that's part of it, but that's just,
And as I said, you know, I feel like, you know, it's not like I'm saying, oh, down with community. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that, like I said, like, I just think it's interesting how quickly we're like, we don't want to live in or deal in the antagonism. And so I think that's why you're right. Like, there's a move towards a certain kind of affirmational move. And I'm like, I'm not saying that that's not important. It has room. It has a certain kind of gravitas and utility. Yeah. But I think oftentimes it's like, but like, people treat you badly, you know.
And then in turn, you treat other people badly.
Right.
It becomes this source of pathology that.
Right. You know, that can exist. Right. And so even with the thinkers, you know, like I think, you know, Ralph Ellison, I think is a really example. You know, it's like he has all of these moments where like it would just be as simple as like a citation, and he just is like, oh, I'm not going to do it. Or it's one of those things where like he does it, but because we're so enamored with the genius, it's like you, that's socially understood. It's like you'd have to go read like the interviews and like one of the edited collections, you know, to be able to find it and see like, oh yeah, you know, like he does kind of engage in some citation practices that, you know, that kind of can help us understand some things. You know, and again, and in his case too, you know, there's a moment where, you know, he says, you know, Irving Howe has this essay where basically he says, you know, like his ancestors, Ellison's ancestors are James Baldwin and Richard Wright. And he says, those are not my ancestors, those are my relatives. but my ancestors are, Hemingway.
But also, yes, I'm like, if we gonna, yeah, but also it may be, not maybe, but like, I mean, given the history of slavery, we got to,
Right.
I mean, we got some white ants. I mean,
Right, so-
Phenomenon. of
Right.
the Atlantic century, but, like,
Right, so it's
slavery.
all like so fraught,
Ooh, but
right?
it's also like,
Yeah.
gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah, like, okay, even as, as I'm arguing in the chapter, even as it would appear that much of his understanding of the underground that we see in Invisible Man is really kind of a replaying of Richard Wright,
Mhm.
right? So it's kind of like, so that to me is something that we should really kind of unpack. That antagonism is something to me, I think that should be unpacked as opposed to like, oh, what's, great American novel.
Mhm.
Yes, right. But also like there's all this other stuff that's happening, right? So I think, yeah, like when I think about Black genius, that's I think why I'm like, Hathaway saying the Black pool of genius. I'm like, oh, maybe, maybe it's not, maybe that kind of alleviates some of the fraughtness,
Mhm.
right? Because I think the other thing too, which is I think also why like I think your question is really interesting, is because there's a way, and I think the book is also getting at this, that Black genius has kind of been trademarked. Like it's like
Mhm.
Black genius, and it tends to have a certain look,
Mhm.
it tends to be like, riven with certain kinds of like, again, I think about someone like Frederick, like, although Frederick Douglass is known as a great, very great orator, the thing about Frederick Douglass when he was giving abolition speeches, people often wrote about how handsome he was. So like there's a way, Black genius sometimes is very much around beauty politics. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going around Black genius. So that's why I'm like, maybe lowercase Black genius, maybe it's like the goal or something like that. But yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know. And again, maybe Hathaway gives an intervention that maybe removes some of the fraughtness. But yeah, I think that you're right. Like maybe it's about really kind of sitting in the antagonism. And maybe that's the way in which we might find a way to do our work.
Mhm. That's right. Well, I will not hog up more time. I mean, we're friends, we can talk later, but,
I still may ask you a question.
oh, okay, well, let's let other folks.
Yes, for sure.
So I would like to give you a round of applause for. I have a question that we have for Professor Durham. Oh, yes, hi.
Hi.
Hello.
This is more of just like, picking your brain in terms of, I don't know if, Say Black and I has an audiobook, but if it did, if we're talking about the structure of it, so you're talking about your writing in the symphony, how would you honor that?
Question, come on, question.
In the form of an audiobook?
In the form of, or the media of audio that will best honor.
Yeah,
your
that's a great
audiobook.
question. Yeah. So for a while I thought about trying to record an audiobook for the book. In part because especially in the Marvin Gaye chapter, there's an argument that I make that will require me to sing. So there is a kind of there has been a desire to kind of record the audiobook. And also, again, as I'm kind of interested in the notion of the sound studies and that kind of thing. You understand, like, and the people in the audience who are professors understand, like, there's a way that, like, I think the project is hemmed up because it's a book, if that makes sense. Like,
And it's a scholarly manuscript.
yeah, like there's and it's my first book, so there's a kind of, there are all these kind of interesting conventions about show what you can do and cover a whole bunch of bases, show that you know the field and show that you're right. So, in a perfect world, I actually think that this project would actually be best done as a museum curation. I think. As a museum curation, or, I think something sonic would be interesting. So, for example, I wrote an article about touch in the film Moonlight, and I made a playlist. So for a while, I was like, oh, maybe I'll do a playlist. Which I think, kind of can satisfy some of the sonic things that I'm interested in. But I think so much of the kind of, the hemming up actually aligns with your question, is that I think it being bound as a book limits it. And yet it's required. Yeah.
What about, it's not a podcast, but like an album, so like, right now we're seeing like poetry albums, are in existence. Would that be closer to where it's not necessarily a traditional reading of the book, but a summation of everything that inspired it along with the text, along with the dramaturgy?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think, certainly if something like poetry album will be in line with like, say, all the albums in the 70s that Nikki Giovanni, makes. What's his name? Langston Hughes, Ask Your Mama is an album. So yeah, I mean, it would totally be in line with a certain kind of legacy of that. Yeah, I mean, I know it's not really not like a kind of fully fleshed out answer, but yeah, I mean, I think your question is totally in line with some of my own anxiety about the book in the aftermath of its publication, because like I said, you read it and you're kind of like, wow, I wrote that, but was there something different that I could have done? And again, for the constraints of the Academy, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you're hemmed in to do. So yeah, I mean, I think yes. To your question, yes. And whatever that residue has, yeah.
More questions?
Yes.
So, my question is kind of building off the discussion on Black genius. I was wondering about so another term that came to mind that's related is Black cool. And which is also kind of gendered and very particular with this. So I was wondering about whether that comes into play at all, or like your general thoughts on that, and sort of its relation to Black genius.
Yeah.
So, yeah, how gender kind of
Yeah. There is a moment in the introduction where I cite an essay in the book Black Cool. It's the essay on, I think it's what I wrote. I think it's the essay on genius in Black Cool. The thing about Black Cool that I think the book is getting at is that the only time we really register the cool is in the performance. And so, Ralph Ellison's mother is not cool. She's not cool. There's a way that I would even say, like, in the chapter on Octavia Butler, there's a way that like she's not really cool. Even though she's kind of producing the art. So I think that's one of the reasons why in the book, the notion of cool isn't so formative to my thinking, is because I think it's a little,
Sorry.
it's kind of like, again, Black cool trademark. It's like, oh, but I think that is why I'm interested in, so to your question about sound studies, why I'm interested in the echo. To me, the echo is the cool thing, because the echo is the thing that really kind of helps me figure out like who made this happen. Like, and kind of impart whatever that is to that origin. There's another moment I think in the book where I say something like, we're enamored with the output, but we're bored with the origin. I think I said something like that. But yeah, like, so, and I think too, as someone who has a background in the arts and in singing, the cool, to me at least, I've always found that like the cool moment of the performance is not the performance. it's really the rehearsal. Yeah. Like, because in rehearsal, what happens is that like, that's the genius. Like, it's the moment. So for what's worth, in college, I sang a cappella. 2 people from my singing group are in the crowd. The genius is in rehearsal when the arrangement comes together. Because by the time you get to the performance, you're actually quite tired. Because you've been working and work, right? So like, to me, and certainly, people like Fred Moten, the rehearsal, right? Yes. But I think like, I also have an understanding that in a very pragmatic and like embodied way, because we were rehearsing all the time to get to a place where we could get up and not look foolish with the arrangement. And so, yeah, I think Black Cool has a space in the work, but in a way, I also am kind of trying to throw it away because I think it's kind of boring. Even as I'm like, yes, gratitude, like Marvin Gaye, of course, Trouble Man, like that lets me do my work. Like, yes, thank you for that cool moment. But also I'm like, but there's all this other stuff that's happening. And I mean, again, maybe this is also my question to you. Like, I think that you help understand that in your work, when you're talking about the assembly, like how all these people are coming together to make it possible to record this album, even though it is not a success, right? So, like, but also that there's that moment in the book where we find out that Minnie Riperton's cool because of Stevie Wonder, where he's like, what's your name? And she's like, Minnie. And he's like, you're not Minnie Riperton. I love your work, right? Like, there's something else that's going on. And so maybe also Blackpool has something to do with like who acknowledges you and who doesn't. Maybe there's that. But yeah, again, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to do this with you is because I feel like you, in light of this question, you kind of are also thinking like, I'm thinking like, there's all this other stuff happening before the recording, before the performance, that actually is the cool thing. Not the, how many records get sold, or whether or not, we can tell all the songs in order on the album. But the fact that like, all these people made this thing possible, and are messing around with genre, and form. So yeah. I think that's my response to Black.
I think also there's this way that the black pool gets to be weaponized and leveraged. It's like, okay, Miles Davis is like emblematic of the Black pool, but he was also putting his hands on Sid Tyson.
Right, exactly.
Right. And Betty Davis. So it's like,
right.
It is a very, I think it's very nefarious in that it gets to elide.
Yes.
Like what is left in the
in the wake
of achieving, being able to produce that.
And I think too, to your point, that's also one of the reasons why when I'm talking about the book, I often will say like, some of what I'm up to around the race man is really trying to unpack hero worship, which I think is a mode of Black cool. Like I said with Marvin Gaye, like, it's like, we don't talk about that kind of stuff like that. That ruins the mystique, right? That ruins the perception that like, he is this, like sexual healer, he's our hero. And I think that also is actually emblematic of the intramural, is because I think, again, oftentimes in the academy, we're kind of conditioned or taught to read toward, it doesn't happen all the time, admittedly. So I'm not saying it's like a carte blanche kind of thing, but I feel like sometimes we are oftentimes taught to read nicely. Like, don't, and so I think sometimes what happens, and maybe again, this is also kind of the residue of a certain kind of Black cool. So what happens is that like, when you don't read nicely, you're not cool. Which is maybe why I'm like, I'm kind of bored with it. Like I'd rather read against the thing. I'd rather kind of be uncool if it means that I kind of am getting to a place where maybe you can ask me a question, I can be like, I don't really know. But I'm really kind of trying to strive to figure out if I can get to a place where I might know.
This
So-
is deeply uncool to say out loud. You're supposed to know everything.
Right, I'm supposed to know, right, yeah. And again, you know, it's like a kind of condition that happens too, but yeah, I think that, yeah, black cool is a kind of, like, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful question. More questions?
Yes.
Thank you so much, both of you, for this. So I'd love to hear more from you about, I mean, particularly the way that you're appreciating how in order for us to eventually find ourselves in a place of doing the work that we want to do, that we have to fundamentally do so from a place of refusal of this kind of progressiveness. So I'd love to hear a bit more about ambivalence as necessary to allow for some unlearning, to actually be to make it possible to do the Black study that we want to do.
Yeah. So as I shared earlier, I've been in a lot of different spaces in the academy. And so I think the ways that I've been taught to learn are varied. And what I mean by that is, like, you know, in architecture school, you know, you're really learning how to train your hand. You know, in seminary, you're really trying to kind of like capture the spirit, right? And then in, you know, in English department, you're really learning how to kind of like train your eye. I think that all of that training has meant that, as I just said, that there's a way in which I've been taught to learn that sometimes meant that saying what was on the page was not really a good idea. So like I said, with someone like Marvin Gaye, it's always interesting. It happens every year. Like, especially on social media, like almost every year, like clockwork, someone will find out something about Frederick Douglass and be like, Frederick Douglass did that? Or like Marvin Gaye, and they'll be like, Marvin Gaye did that, right? There's a way, so I'm always interested because I'm like, I mean,
It's literally right.
it's like right
there.
there, right? It's like right there, right? So there is a way in which I think, you know, some of the kind of learning and unlearning is like maybe just about either access or just the fact of being able to tell a certain kind of story, I guess. But I also think that the unlearning for me was important because certainly as a professor, I think that it helps me to understand the cultivation of a critical posture. And so what I mean by that is that, like, certainly in my classes, the students are coming in with a kind of way of reading the world that, and it's not their fault at all, right? But they kind of come in with a reading the world where when you kind of say to them, let's start peeling back a little bit, you know, what's going on, they're like, oh, well, when that happened here, that has relevance to what's going on here. And I'm like, yeah, like it's the peeling back kind of gives a kind of critical lens for how to think and rethink things. So I think for me, like I'm grateful for the learning, like it's got me here. But I think that some of the unlearning is about kind of refocusing my own eye, my own critical thinking and aperture. And I think too, the thing about unlearning is, and I think this is happening also in the book, is that what unlearning also allows me to do is it also allows me to think more broadly about who I'm working with and thinking with. So like, for example, like it's very, for the kind of work that I'm doing, citing someone like Spillers is very easy. Like she's kind of that foremost thinker in my head, right? In a way, right? But at the same time, like, to me, recuperating, and I don't want to say recuperating, that's wrong. Listening closer to Mary Helen Washington in my work means that, like, there are other people who, again, in a mode of unlearning, because I mean, I can remember, and again, this is kind of gets into kind of like the weeds again, the academy. Like I can remember writing a cover letter and someone saying to me, why don't you name these two people in my cover letter? And so there's a way that like, even then, like, the unlearning helps me to open up my possibility for who I also might be reading and thinking with and thinking alongside, as opposed to kind of constantly rehearsing the same voices over and over and over again, because in some ways that's also the training. Like, that sometimes the work is not legitimate unless you're citing 2 or 3 people. And I think that's also one of the reasons why, you know, again, in the book, I'm like, what would it mean to really sit with Octavia Butler? Like, really sit with what she's up to. And I think too, for what I'm up to in the project, I think it also is why in the book, although I'm thinking about psychoanalysis, I'm not really citing a lot of people who write psychoanalysis. Why I'm not really citing a lot of people who write affect theory is because I'm trying to say that, like, Frederick Douglass can tell us a lot without me having to cite, name psychoanalytic thinker, or name affect theorist, right? It's not to say that the work isn't important, it is, right? But I think, again, like, it really reframes even who I'm thinking with. So I think that, yeah, like, the unlearning really undoes so much that's been done, maybe to me. But I think, and I mean, again, like, you know, I'll share this and then I'll shut up. Like, I think a lot about people who graduated from my PhD program, who when they had read the books, they said, I had to go undo everything.
Yep.
Like, I had to go get in the archive. Like, I had to go think about these things for myself. Again, the frame of it is very particular because, like, you're writing for a committee and you're right? But so many people I know who end up with PhD and are pivoting towards the book are like, I had to rethink a whole bunch of stuff. So I think, you know, it manifests in this book, but I think it's an ongoing process of, like, just constantly, like, what does it mean to think anew with these people, or think anew with voices that are, generally speaking, not in the greatest hits, right? Or what does it mean to, like, cite my contemporaries, right? Or do events with my contemporaries, right? Yeah, I think that's the way that I can unlearn. I think.
Disciplines discipline us.
Right.
So yeah, that's the greatest lesson I ever learned from graduate school, is that disciplines are meant to discipline you.
Yeah.
And you better stay in line, or else you may not get a job, you may not get a book, you may not get a lot of things.
Yeah.
But.
And I think that's why I was saying, like, you know, the book emerges from a place where I was like, I don't know what's about to happen to me. And the other thing too is that, for what it's worth, the book was written in 2020. So it was really like, I have no idea what's about to happen. Like, I don't know what's about to happen. So, like, I'm just gonna go out on a limb and just kind of say what I think. And, like, kind of take whatever comes with that. Because I don't know what's about, like, I don't know if I'm gonna get a job. Who knows if we're gonna live? You know, who knows what's about to happen? Like, let me just go ahead and say what I think and say what I'm feeling about these people. And let's see where, like, the chips fall, right? And I think even that's a way of unlearning, because, again, there is a way in which we are kind of conditioned to believe that, like, you know, you have to do it this way. You have to say, again, you have to cite these people. You have to say these things. You know, don't talk about that person, you know, because.
Or if you do, only in the affirmative.
Right, you know. And I mean, and that goes for even the people that I'm writing about, because, like I said, you know, again, you know, it's not that there aren't criticisms of Frederick Douglass. There are, and I read them. But again, like, even when I think about my coursework with Frederick Douglass, like, a lot of it's very positive. Like, it's very aspirational. You know, a man was made a slave. Now you see a slave man. Yes, yes, great. But I mean, there's so much even to unpack about Frederick Douglass's own writing about himself, right? And so I think that's also why I'm saying that the goal of my book was not to be right, but to really say, like, if you read it, when you encounter Frederick Douglass again, hopefully you think about him in a different way. All the people I'm writing think about them in a different way. And I think, again, like, that's the way that I try to unlearn. But I think, again, that also means that there's a lot of tension on the page, because on the page, it's like, I'm like, this is what I was taught, but this is what I see. This is what I hear. What does it mean to, like, say this? You know, now that it's out, do I still stand by what I said?
I said what I said.
Like I said, right. You know, I stand by what I said, but like maybe there are implications that are deeper than what I even knew when I was writing it.
Mhm.
You know, all that's also, I think, the process of learning.
Well,
Thank you for that question.
are there any more questions for this beautiful, beautiful human and this beautiful, beautiful book?
Should I ask you a question? Is there time?
Yeah, is there time? It's.
We're getting there.
Another
event.
Yeah, I can be quick, I can be quick, I guess.
So I was gonna say, like, in your own work, where do you find the melancholy and genius?
That's so funny, because shortly after I finished the PhD, I wrote this piece for this blog called Hyped on Melancholy. It's like a music. And it was about George Clinton's Atomic Dog, and I would just think writing through melancholy in that particular context, and like the long history of Black folks' relationship to like dogs and so I have concretely thought about melancholy and maybe implicitly genius, but I think the way that you are trying to write about the intramural is a lot of the way that I, in another project I'm working on, that I'm trying to really take seriously the intramural as a source of both antagonism, but also genius. But I'm thinking about the format of the LP. In the context of the 1970s primarily, and what that format lends itself to, in particular, and especially in relationship to Black masculine genius. So the work of funk musicians, that's a lot of the albums that I'm encountering and coming across. And just the way that even in those contexts, the Black feminine maternal is the vestibule for these works. And the clearest of that, you see that so clearly by way of album art, right? That
The mothership.
yes, the mothership, or just even how just the haptics of the LP when you're opening and closing, and the way that a Black woman's bodies are used alongside the gatefold to engender this concept of an album. It's just so yeah, it's like I'm trying to think about, and it's related to this loss around being a man, failing at manhood, and then this becomes the raw materials for this reimagining of Black masculinity. So it's like on one end you're trying to, in some ways, disarticulate yourself from this kind of cisnormative conception of what it means to be a man, right? But also very problematically, and even in some cases, like violently, like folk getting, Esther Cordet, who's a Playmate model, gets burned and gets lesions because of pouring hot honey on herself for the Ohio Players album Honey. Right, so even at the, very material level that you get to engage in kind of performativity around your masculinity, but also you're in harming someone else. So that's it. Also, on a personal level, it just bums me out because I like it's like I love these works, but also it's sad. Like, why?
Yes, and I think that's exactly right. Like it's hard because you're like, I'm a fan, but
yeah, it bums me.
Yeah, like it really,
bums me.
it's like, So it's like you have to become like a critical fan.
Yeah, which can you be a fan?
Yeah, and be critical.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
You understand?
Yeah. Right.
All right, I think that's it.
Yes.
Thank you so much. All right. 5 people that tuned in.
Yes,
Thank you.
you.
Thank you both so much.
Sorry for running over time.